It's day one of Marvel Snap's brand new beach season. Let's rate every card that's going to drop in this season. Jeff, the baby dolphin, is a 2/2 with movable, meaning it can move once per game. Every card that reveals on the lane that Jeff the baby dolphin is in does so with +1 power. This means that it is one of the highest floor Marvel Snap cards that I have ever seen in my entire time playing this game. This card is the most guaranteed 4 or above star card that I have ever legitimately reviewed. The big question for Jeff is, will he be a 5-star card where he is metagame defining in his own right? To me, there is a difference between a card that is very good and goes in a lot of decks versus a card that is a Star-Lord and Sholau level of disruption in the metagame. A real 5-star card is going to be those things. And while I am very sure that Jeff will not end up being bad, I am a lot less sure at what his ceiling is ultimately going to be. The biggest conflict for Jeff right now is that he wants to be a card that goes in buff decks. Buff decks are largely about taking a buff, giving it to the next person, and multiplying it successively, so he seems like a good fit. But Jeff is a 2-cost card, and Storm Horseman of Famine is a defining card in buff decks right now, and basically says that you can't play 2-cost cards in decks that are playing her, which means that Jeff might end up being worse in the best buff deck than something else would be. You might be making your incredibly powerful stick deck a little bit worse by including Jeff instead of Storm, because I do think you have to choose between them. I think there's about a 50% chance that the combination of Jeff and Sam Wilson ends up supplanting Storm Horseman of Famine, and at the very least, it's a mark in Jeff's favor that he can do a very reasonable impression of the power level of that card. At the bare minimum, he's going to be the easiest replacement if you do not own Storm. So with all of that in mind, I do think that it's very likely that this guy ends up being a 5-star card, because it's not just that he's going to be a very viable option in what is probably the best deck. He's going to stick around as a card that is necessary in a bunch of different things. Anything that overlaps with move, anything that overlaps, like if you're playing the multiple man deck, you're probably playing Jeff. If you're playing the Batroc deck, you're probably playing Jeff. There are a bunch of decks that this guy is going to go in, and he might even be strong enough that if you're playing any kind of mid-range deck at all, you're going to be playing Jeff. However, I do think that he releases in a weirdly hostile metagame, because one of the major metagame dynamics that happens with buff-related cards is that the deck that does the most power of the green power decks usually ends up coming out on top, because it's winning the mirrors. And the deck that is able to do the most power winning the mirrors, especially if that deck becomes the best deck in the game, as the Stick Captain Carter deck currently is, well, a lot of people are going to be running stuff that is good against green power decks. So they're going to naturally have things like Shadow King Grandmaster targeting the Carter decks that are going to be good against Jeff. So what's interesting here is that if he doesn't make it in to that shell, it's possible that he gets regarded as a bit of a dud in his release month. But I am fairly confident that this is a card that at some point in the course of the next 6 months will be regarded as one of the best cards in the game. I just think that the current metagame is actually pretty hostile to him right now, because Storm maybe pushes him out of his own best deck and into a bunch of tier 2 stuff that is weirdly getting countered by people aiming at that best deck. I'll be really interested to see how this situation develops, because I do think the floor is very high, but this is definitely a situation where I'm cautious to give this the rating that I think it probably will deserve in the near future, because I don't want people to look at me and call me a shill for overrating the season pass card. So out of deference to that, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to split the difference, and I'm going to say Jeff is a 4.5-star card, and then in 6 months, when he's the best card in the game, someone's going to quote this and clip it out of context and be like, look at KM, he's such an idiot. Just know I'm doing this to preempt that. Venus has a lot of similar dynamics to Jeff, I think, in that she is a card that wants to be in certain types of buff decks, but right now those buff decks don't want to be about her. While Jeff, I think, is more of a 50-50 for, like, this might actually be better than the things we're currently doing, This card, I think, is likely to not end up being better than the Captain Carter Maverick stuff. I think that's basically where my head is at. It's usually going to be better to be doing the current versions of the Stick, Carter, Maverick decks than doing things with Venus and Sebastian Shaw and things of that nature. And the same dynamic that I talked about with Jeff, where it's like, okay, this is definitely going to get hurt by my opponent's ability to do things like play cards. That also is important. They're going to play Shadow King on me, but they're aiming for the Storm decks, but they're hitting me with their Shadow Kings. That is also a very notable thing to me with Venus. I think there are other shells that kind of make sense for her. Like, I can see her as like a card in Aurora decks or whatever, but it's hard to play those right now. Maybe she ends up making a difference in the multiple man decks. Again, a pretty difficult deck to play. Maybe she could go into Batroc decks. I'm not particularly sure, but Sam Wilson Batroc getting extra points is pretty compelling. Craven getting extra points is pretty compelling. I don't know if I'm going to have the time to play her out, but there's not nothing there, I think. This is a card that is built for a metagame that isn't this one, in much the same way that Jeff is, and it makes it very difficult to rate, because I think this is a card that, in a world where, let's say, they actually make the necessary nerfs to things like Mother Ascani and Prodigy and Captain Carter, well, then suddenly we're in a world where the best deck is not inviting a bunch of hate on everything else that's doing green power, right? Like, we are currently in a world where if you're playing a Venus deck, I think the median outcome is that you're losing to the Stick decks, and then you're also losing to the people that are trying to beat the Stick decks, which is weird and weirdly hostile for a buff season. But that's the dynamic I'm basically expecting. I'm expecting that this first week is going to be full of stuff that is going to beat the Captain Carter decks, and that stuff, by definition, is going to also beat this, and that this is not going to have enough points to win a pseudo mirror against the Captain Carter decks, so you end up with just a bunch of bad matchups that make the card feel worse than it is. I don't know what the future holds for this, and that's really, really tough, but I do expect it to be fairly medium in the short term, while maybe having potential to break out. In much the same way as I think Jeff is a really powerful card that is not necessarily going to feel as powerful as he is right now, but like, what I'm saying is Jeff probably releases at 4.5 and goes to 5 over time, basically. This is a card that sort of feels like it releases at 3.5 and could get up to 4, you know? Like, I'm a lot more sure of the floor for Jeff than I am for Venus. And so I do think that this is a card that is, if a deck like this is going to be good, it would take a nerf to Captain Carter. But, like, you know, while I've been talking about on my channel recently, it's like, you make Captain Carter 4/4, you change a couple of the Prodigy Ascani stuff. Suddenly we're in a world where people are playing like fair mid-range again. If Batroc is ever a deck, I think this card is the kind of card that sees play in a metagame where Batroc is a deck, right? Like, that kind of relatively lower power metagame is what this card is more made for. And I don't think we're in it right now. And so I think she's going to release and feel a little bit more like a clunk than she is. And if she feels great on release, then I think that she has like legitimate upward mobility here. But largely, I think that Venus is a 3-star card, but this is a really tough one for me because I think she could very easily get higher than that. She's just going to feel like that right now. There's still a lot to explore here, and frankly, this is probably the rating in here that is going to look the worst in hindsight, if I had to guess. But I think she's going to feel like a 3 right now, and then maybe in a metagame that's a little more helpful to her, she'll feel a little bit more like a 4, or maybe even a build around that's a little bit higher. Monstro is one of the easier cards, in my opinion, to rate because I just don't think this card is good. An 8/8 that reduces its cost by the cost of your top card. I think it is sort of just ridiculous on its face to look at this and then look at Wilson Fisk and then tell me that these are in any way close to similar, in any way like this card is anywhere near as good as what Wilson Fisk is offering. Wilson Fisk's quest is easier. You have more control over it. You know more about whether it's going to happen. He has a bigger body. In order for this card to get down to 3/8, you have to have a 5 cost on top of your deck, and you need to be building your deck with a bunch of 5 and 6 costs in order to make that make sense. There is nowhere that makes sense for this card. I think if it said 7 cost, that'd be much better. I think if it said 10 power, that'd be much better. But in service of this guy being an octopus, seemingly they kept it at 8 and 8, and I think that has hamstrung this card, even though I'm not sure octopi actually have any hamstrings. To me, this is a very easy 1-star card. I do not think it is worth getting. I think there are very very few scenarios I can imagine where I would want to be doing this. In any scenario where it ever actually, by some miracle, became worth doing, it would get shut down harder than any card in the history of cards by Mobius. And Mobius, good lord, I can't even begin to imagine it. Not only is this a 1-star card, I honestly thought about breaking the system just so I could call this a 0-star card. There is really nothing else to say here. Jubilee Silver Surfer is another card that I think the delta is pretty wide on. When I look at this card, I see either a 5-star card or a 1-star card, and I'm not going to split the difference on this one as much as I normally would. I think that this is a card that is likely to look cool, but unless I am missing something, which is entirely possible, and, also, future balance changes pending, right? I take no responsibility for those. I find it hard to believe that given the current construction of the dominant buff deck, that I would want to be playing this card. Now, there are a couple of things that are pretty cool you can do with it, right? Like what you can do is you can play an Agony in a lane, move a Jeff into that lane, Prodigy the Agony, and then you'd have like a 10 power version of this. And I think that is really cool, and that is really sick, and maybe that justifies playing it to some degree, because obviously putting +10 on stuff is awesome. But the way the current versions of the buff decks are scaling, +10 on something I don't pick is not as good as putting that number on something that I do pick. And I think that's the big thing for me, is that whenever I play the buff decks, I feel like it genuinely doesn't matter what numbers are on any of my other cards. I am supposed to do the thing that multiplies and launders the buff anyway, just in terms of that is more points. It is like, there are going to be, if I'm playing this deck, like there are going to be situations where I would have played this, and what I should have done is literally just played a Captain Carter on turn 4 and then a Maverick on turn 5 and then Prodigied the Captain Carter on 6 and brooded off the Maverick. That is the big problem that I have with this card, where it's like, I get that it could be cool. Like I totally buy that. But I find it hard to believe that it's going to be better than what we're currently doing. And again, that's a little like temporal, and I can only be temporal when I do these kind of evaluations. I obviously can't see the future. They could change a million things, right? Like I had someone in my Discord today say that they said Captain Carter was going to be broken when they originally changed it to 3 cost, and that because it was broken now that they were right then. And I just like that, sort of the opposite of the methodology that I take, where it's like, what's actually going on here is I can evaluate it right now, and if they change a bunch of stuff, like if they make a card that makes this way better, the way they did Maverick for Captain Carter, then yeah, it might be problematic in the future. But as is, I find it hard to envision this card actually making a dent. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say this is a 2-star card that ends up being a lot more of an entertaining dream than a reality. Quicksand is a Series 4 coming out of High Voltage Overdrive. This is a 2/4 with an ability that triggers whenever your opponent starts the turn with bonus energy. They will not get it. Now, to the best of my knowledge, bonus energy is whenever they would have more energy than the turn count. That is to say, if you are playing Fallen One, I realize that it says set. If you're playing Arashim, I realize that it says gain +1 maximum. If you're playing Electro, I realize it says gain +1 maximum. My understanding is that max energy is just bonus energy, but it stays there. So it will still be affected by this card. My source for that is Jim Hammond, who says bonus energy has exactly the same wording as this card and works with all of those cards. So unless there is something deeply wrong on the back end at Second Dinner here, and they really need to change how their wording works, this card will work on anything that would give Jim Hammond power, which is to say, anytime you have more energy than your turn will suggest. But it only works once, so that Electro won't give you energy on the first turn of that Electro, but the rest of the turns you will get the energy. And the same goes for Arashim. However, this is a remarkably good card against things like the Fallen One and Star-Lord Master of the Sun. It's also got a pretty aggressive 2/4 stat line, which I suspect is to compensate for the fact that it does only work one time. This is largely, I would guess, in a world where they're trying to make sure that they don't want to make the Mobius of extra energy, because it's actually fairly easy to break the synergy if this card works every time. Something like Luna Snow would be obviously ridiculous if you could do that. Curve my 2/4 into my 3/6 and I get energy and you don't get energy does not seem like a good gameplay experience to encourage, and is probably a big part of not only why this card has a one-time clause, but also why they felt they needed to give it a bigger body in order for it to be that. What I'm interested in is, will this card actually work? The one card I'm pretty sure it does always counter is the Fallen one. But what I'm really interested in is the specific wording on when they start a turn with bonus energy. What happens if my opponent has a Luna Snow out and also Fallen ones? Does all the bonus energy get stopped, or just the Luna Snow? I think what happens is very up for debate. My best guess based on the wording is if I play this on turn, I reveal this on turn 5, they play a Star-Lord while having a Luna Snow, I think they don't get any of the energy, but I'm not actually sure. And like the counterpoint here would be if I played this on turn 4 and it revealed on turn 4, the Luna Snow was already up on the board and blew this effect on turn 5 before they played the Star-Lord, then yeah, I wouldn't be stopping it. But what I'm wondering about is the exact wording of what happens if it reveals at that specific point. I think that's pretty interesting. I also kind of like that they didn't tie it into priority. It just happens at the beginning of the next turn, because if I had to care about priority with this, I think it would be a much less effective card at doing the job it's supposed to do. On the whole, I think this is a card that I am happy is in the game, but is likely to end up more like Gorgon than anything else. Just a solid 3-star card that you're going to be happy to have, that'll show up occasionally, and very often will not be a part of the deck you are making. Submariner, a 1/2. When this is empowered, add a random 1-cost card to your hand with that same increase, whether this card is in hand or in play. The direction I see this card going is sort of Viv Vision, where it gets to be Clea 2 effectively, and you're just playing a bunch of cards that have some additional buffs on them, and that seems like a pretty reasonable space for a card to be in. Clea 2 is not a bad thing for this to be. I think it's probably worse than Clea, because Clea gets to do the Joaquin Torres stuff to get double value off of it, and I don't really see a lot of good ways to get double value off of this. I think the other thing that sticks out about this card is I don't think I'm particularly likely to be playing this as an endpoint to my stick-based combo. Like, if I'm doing one of those decks that's passing through a bunch of buffs from buff to buff to buff, this guy's bad because he needs to happen on turn 5. And I don't think I'm ever going to want to do that a lot of the time. Now, it's possible that I might just like having that option on a 1-cost card in a deck like that. Who knows? Like, maybe I just play this because sometimes I hit it with Storm and I just get to fill up my curve and get some free 1-costs in my, stick deck or whatever. I don't know. It's entirely possible, although I would be concerned about overfilling your hand to some degree. But I'd imagine you could probably do it, and it wouldn't be like the worst thing anyone's ever done. This is a card that I think long-term has a home as Clea 2 in whatever decks would be playing Clea. This is a card that wants to be in a Marvel Boy Zoo kind of deck. Maybe you're getting a Venus in there, doing Venus, Marvel Boy, Clea in this. Like, suddenly that kind of deck is much more real. It's definitely a deck that has needed a second Clea, because a lot of it is like, if I have the Clea, I'm doing really awesome stuff. And if I don't have the Clea, I'm not doing any really awesome stuff. And so having Clea 2 is a big buff to a deck like that. We just saw how this works with, like, Maverick getting stick. Even if the second copy of the card that your deck is built around is worse, you're still benefiting pretty heavily just from having it in terms of consistency. Your deck is going to have a lot more playable draws, and that's a really important thing for those decks. And so even if this guy's not broken on his own terms, he could end up seeing play as a sort of contextually useful piece there. Gut check, I want to say this is a 2.5-star card. I don't think he rises above to the level of being incredibly overpowered. I think it's very hard for a 1-cost card to do that, though, so maybe I should be grading him on a curve. A pretty compelling 1-cost that I'm happy they made. It's just held back by the nature of a 1-cost card being your build around. I'm not super seeing it with Triton, but I think much like Quicksand, this is actually just secretly a tech card. I don't know that this guy's a guy I'm playing in buff decks for his own purposes, but I do know that if I want to beat any kind of Cerebro deck, I can just put this guy in my deck and he will be fine. And I think that that is the main mode that this card actually has in terms of functionality, in much the same way as Quicksand's really not going to show up a lot of the time, just because it's whatever, right? Like, it's kind of fine. It's just like, that's, well, whatever. It's quicksand. I don't need to actually be countering this extra energy stuff until you do, right? Until you actually do, until they do a Star-Lord type thing, until Fallen One becomes broken. You don't need that card. It's just nice to have. And I think in much the same way, that's what this card is, but for Cerebro. And so you don't need that card. It's just nice to have. But I don't know that Cerebro has ever been as broken as getting extra energy. So I'm going to dock this one down where I had Quicksand at a 3-star card. This one is a worse body with an effect that's probably a lot more limited. And maybe you can make it work in terms of actually being part of a buff deck. It could be like a card that maybe replaces another card if you don't necessarily own it. So that kind of stuff is there as well. But largely, I think this is relegated to budget replacement / occasional tech. Sounds like a 2.5-star card to me. Last up is Namorita, a 3/5, where if she's alone at a location, the cards you draw get -1 cost. I do think this card is good in a metagame that isn't this, which is to say, if I am ever playing, like, if I were playing Sholau, I would say this card is good. If I were playing Zombie Giant Man, I would say this card is good. In those kinds of mid-range decks, and these have existed for an extended period in Marvel Snap, which are like mid-range decks, and it's a bunch of 1s through 3s, and then there's one big 5, and that guy's the guy, and you look at like Darkhawk, you look at Ronin, you look at Devil Dinosaur, you look at Zombie Giant Man, you look at Sholau. There's been a lot of decks like that, and this is a good card in decks like that. There are not a lot of decks like that right now, and that is a problem. But I am fairly compelled by at least giving this a shot in, like, a super giant deck where it's just a good body or things like that I'm just going to be able to do cool stuff with and get some extra discounts on and just be happy about this being a good mid-range card. I think it's solid. I think that this is a card that might, again, not necessarily be released in the right time frame for this to be good, but I do think that there are going to be points at which this is going to be a relevant metagame card in whatever mid-range deck is doing stuff. 3/5 and discounting some stuff. If you want a second Surge or a Surge with a better body, this is going to be a card you are interested in. I think a lot of the time it's just going to be a very solid thing to have around. My best guess for a card like this is 3.5 stars. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I have been KMBest. You have been phenomenal, and I will see you in the next one.